My topic today, as you can see, is new leadership, or leadership renaissance, new leadership for a fast-paced world. And there's my own slide saying the same thing. And I plan to cover the following: the leadership paradox, and I'll explain exactly what that is. I'm going to talk about leadership in a VUCA world, and some of you may be familiar with the term, others not, but I'll explain what we mean by that. Then I'm going to talk about lived, a particular leadership model, and explain how we've linked it to something called the leadership pipeline. And again, some of you may be familiar with that. Then I'll talk about how we conduct lived leadership assessments and lived leadership development. And then I'll summarize, and then later on I think there will be the opportunity for you to ask me questions when we join the panel a little later on. So let's talk about this topic, the leadership paradox. And the recently deceased American leadership guru, Warren Bennis, wrote some time ago that it seems the more that is written about the leadership, the less we seem to know. Now, leadership, as we all know, is an extremely hot topic. There's been numerous books written about leadership. Many different leadership theories have been developed over the years, and various descriptions of the characteristics required of effective leaders. So despite all of this material that's existed for many, many, many years, why is it still today there is no universal agreement that this is the definitive leadership model? An interesting question, almost paradoxical. Well, Warren Bennis himself offers us the answer to this question in one of his writings, when he said, well, the issue with leadership is that leaders need to be right for a particular set of circumstances. They need to be right for that particular organization at that particular moment in time. Therefore, quite clearly, one could say that leadership is generally contextual. Leaders have to be right for that organization at that moment. And I often like to use this particular analogy of, we often think about organizations seeking a leader, where the leader, for example, is the hand, and the organization is the glove. And often what we're looking for, it would seem, is a tight fit of that hand moving into the glove. And if we get that tight fit, we think, fantastic, we've got the leader that we want. But the problem then is what happens when the circumstances change, as it often happens nowadays. What happens when the organization has new challenges to face? Is that same leader able to cope with these new set of challenges, these new set of demands? And often we find that that leader doesn't adjust to these new challenges. So that suggests to me that leaders, to be effective, have to be adaptable. They have to be able to adapt to new circumstances. And in this modern world, there are many, many challenges that face us. And many of those challenges are brought about by this term VUCA. VUCA stands for the four words you see there: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I'll explain what we mean by that in a little more detail in a minute. Now, this term was developed by the US military in the late 1990s at the end of the Cold War. And the reason they came up with this term, at that time, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, they no longer perceived a threat, obviously, from the Soviet Empire, as was, and therefore they asked the question, where will future threats come from? And in order to try and answer that question, they looked at the world as we know it today and tried to sort of diagnose and analyze the nature of that world. And they came up with this particular term, because this broadly describes the world that we all live in today. And since then, late 1990s, we've seen gradually over these last 15 odd years, 15, 20 years say, that people have begun to accept this term more and more. So let's look at this term, but before we do, one thing we have to recognize about it, it is now described as the new normal. In other words, it's the status quo. It is how it is today, and we have to recognize that. So let's look at how this term is described in a bit more detail. So first of all, we have volatility. Volatility is described as a high rate of change. The pace of change in the world is getting faster and faster, and it's not going to slow down. Secondly, we have uncertainty, where there is a lack of clarity about the present and the future, so that it is very difficult to understand often what is going on in the world, and when things happen, we can't always explain the way in which they are going to happen, and therefore it makes it extremely difficult to predict the future. The third thing is that the world is highly complex, and there are multiple factors that impact key decisions. Indeed, the world today is so complex that we find that an event on one side of the world coinciding with an event occurring on another side of the world can give rise to a set of circumstances that no one could have foreseen or predicted. And finally, ambiguity. There is a lack of clarity about the meaning of events, so that when things occur, sometimes we can't even explain why they occurred. And this makes confusion and discomfort. So the challenge for us all is to be able to cope with that confusion and discomfort. We live in a world which is constantly changing in an unpredictable way. And today, there is only one certainty, and that is uncertainty. And we have to accept that fact. It's not easy because it makes us feel uncomfortable, but that's the reality. So what does this mean for how it affects organizations? Well, the first thing is we have to accept that VUCA is a permanent condition. It cannot be ignored. It is not going to go away. Often the view has been that things will get easier and things will gradually calm down. The truth is that isn't the case. Secondly, organizations need to be adaptive. I pointed out earlier that it's important that our leaders adapt, and we are in order to cope with these challenges. And that's true of organizations, of course. Organizations, by adapting, can adjust the way they do things, they can learn better, faster, and become a lot more competitive. And of course, that's what most organizations desire. And finally, we need to look at this particular question, therefore, how does it impact our leaders? Because this is all about the organizations in general so far. What about the leaders? What does it mean for them? Well, leadership in a VUCA world can be looked at in a number of ways, but the way I've chosen to approach it is to take the two of the questions that were posed on the video, both of which relate to one's leaders. So, how do you set the tone at the top? How do you ensure your leaders convey the right message in this VUCA environment? And secondly, how do you make sure your leaders can lead the organization through the inevitable changes that every organization is facing? Well, in a VUCA world, we need leaders who can do a number of things, and the first of those is to see beyond the fog of ambiguity. The VUCA world creates this level of chaos, so to speak, and we need leaders who can remain calm and relaxed and cope with these particular pressures. And this means that we need leaders who have a clear sense of where they're trying to go. They need to be focused on the direction that the organization needs to pursue. So they must always retain a clear sense of focus and direction. Secondly, we need leaders who are comfortable being uncomfortable, because the reality of this modern VUCA world is there is this constant level of discomfort. And you need leaders who can therefore understand the marketplace they're operating in and understand themselves, and in so doing have the confidence to be able to behave in a manner that will convey confidence to other people, so they can provide the reassurance to the rest of the organization to help lead that organization forward. But that comes from that inner confidence which is gained through having that understanding and knowing they can cope. Indeed, we believe what we're offering is the only end-to-end leadership assessment and development solution for VUCA readiness. Because there are some organizations that offer you good leadership development programs, there are some that can offer you the means to assess leaders. Very few do both, and even fewer do it with a sort of a focus upon the impact of VUCA. So we believe what we're offering here is unique. So with that, I'll take questions later, and for now, thank you.